Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the penultimate session of the training program on socially generative innovation for development. And now we are headed onto the interesting aspects, the interesting bits of this discussion where we are now starting to compile together the data that we have collected so far in different ways using different modalities and starting to put them together to reveal the nexus and making a judgment whether the nexus is a generative one or an extractive one. So this would be in two parts. We would tackle some of the analysis today in this session and the remaining in the final session with more room for discussion about questions and cases that you might want to discuss. So quickly recapping what we have talked about so far, our inquiry has been driven by this question of how do infrastructure and infrastructure services interact with human and social development outcomes. And we have discussed about concepts of generativity, extractivity, social value, capabilities that are all embedded in this question and form part of the answer and drive the data collection as we try to frame the problem and think about answers. So our data points following the layered, interdependent, and interactive protocol of a multi-layered systemic inquiry is founded in the idea of creating social value for end users, being a user-centered or people-centered inquiry. Our primary intention is to understand the dynamics, the effects, and the causes of outcomes for end users. We have called that as social value. We have discussed that social value is composed of benefits of various kinds, economic and non-economic. Social value is also composed of the burdens and risks that certain interventions or services pose to human development outcomes, and also the long-term externalities, risks, and consequences that get embedded into the system, causing long-term positive or negative consequences, outcomes for human development. On top of this, we have layered data that characterizes the complex interrelationships between the infrastructure, its socio-technical characteristics, as well as the institutional, legal, and innovation systems that surround this relationship of infrastructure and human development. Through various modes, we have collected information that pertains to each of these layers, sometimes at the intersections of these layers. And now it's time that we put together this data and try to build the nearly complete picture that we discussed as the final goal for conducting data-driven problem identification, problem characterization, and eventually solution design. So as we look at whether a particular nexus, first characterize the nexus, in what ways the relationship forms, and then understanding whether it's producing generative outcomes or extracting value from end users, we first need to have a working understanding of nexus. So what do we mean by nexus? Now, the dictionary definition of the noun nexus creates a reasonably good picture of what we are looking at, in fact. So the dictionary says a nexus could mean connection between two or more entities. A nexus could also describe a causal link. It could merely describe groups of connections, a series of similar or not so similar in elements. And it could also describe a center and its relationships around it. So it could be a central with a central actor, or it may not have a central actor. So you can think of various ways in which we live nexuses in our everyday lives. It could be nexus of relationships as individuals, households, and families, or it could be a nexus between the more inanimate elements that surround us, like technology, infrastructure, and also obviously the nexus of as a living individual and nature. In the same spirit, when we think of the nexus as an analytical framework to conduct research, to fit data into and understand transitions, understand the interaction of human development and infrastructure services, it provides us a reasonably broad analytical landscape to start to build out those relationships, interdependencies, and look at and try and explain why certain outcomes happen, how certain outcomes can change over time and under the influence of different interventions. So if you look closely at the four distinct elements of Nexus, there could be more, but largely categorized, a Nexus can be reasonably described by these four elements. So again, starting with the user-centered view, the first element that starts to characterize a Nexus for us is in terms of availability and access of a service, of a resource at the place of its use or at the place of its need. So this could mean electricity service. This could mean availability and access to clean drinking water. Uh, this could mean availability and access of livelihood opportunities and economic activities, and whether they are reachable and in what ways they are accessed by a group of people in a given place. The second kind of characteristics that start to define a nexus are the capabilities to translate these services and resources to well-being outcomes. Now, these capabilities could be at the individual level, at the household, at the collective community level, or at this level of a government entity or institution. What capabilities do they possess that, that enables them make use or translate the available and accessible resource or service to an outcome that is understood to be enhancing well-being or being a positive contributor to the quality of life of that particular entity. The third characterization of Nexus comes in the form of cross-scale influences across the system that either work towards enabling improved outcomes or limit and or diminish capabilities as a result of those interactions. Now, we have discussed about the multi-layered nature of the problem that we are interested in. And naturally, being a multi-layered system, there are very direct and proximate influences, and there are quite a few indirect and distant influences that work on the capability, the availability, and access of resources and services. This could emerge from slow changing natural phenomena, or this could be rapidly developing infrastructure, technology, innovation, or it could be shocks and distinct shifts in the political system and the governance protocols in that particular place. So they work over different timescales, they work over different levels, but they eventually, in connected ways, have an overall effect of enabling or limiting the ability to translate resources and services to well-being outcomes. The fourth and a defining characteristics of Nexus is feedbacks and cascade effects. So, uh, as we have described the interconnected nature across different levels and different kinds of entities, um, naturally, there would be several feedback effects. It's a multi-dimensional communication of information, of resources, um, of perceptions going on in the system. So there are feedbacks that would travel between the different entities and different layers in the system. And what they do is they tend to mitigate or increase risks uh, to the system, or embed in them externalities uh, that play over the longer term and create emergent outcomes which may not have been foreseen at a certain given point of time. So feedback and cascade effects are defining elements and characteristics of nexuses, and are something which are not very obvious when we limit investigation to isolated cause and effect data or cause and effect explanations. It requires feedbacks and cascade effects emerge when we look at the entire systems in its entirety, and also in its portions, in terms of its subsystems. So given this elements of describing and characterizing a nexus, we utilize the data that we have collected so far and try to uh, paint a picture of where are at, and in what ways is the outcome, the human development outcome in terms of social value, is being acted upon by these different elements of the nexus. I'll take you through a series of illustrations to explain the different effects. This is obviously a selection of reasonably complicated interactions that create a nexus, but when put together, they form a larger network that characterizes the system and helps us select a starting point for thinking about solutions going forward. So the first illustration that I want to share with you is of a generative nexus. It's a nexus that is creating positive outcomes in terms of generating social value for its end users. The case that I will discuss is on how the governance and financial elements of the socio-technical system work to de-link the ability to consume and utilize energy uh, among resource constrained households from their income variability. So a quick background about the case study. This is mini hydro powered mini grid in a remote hilly part of the world, where 6 clusters of villages, roughly totaling about 500 households, are connected to a hydro-powered mini grid that supplies electricity to the households throughout the year. What you see here is a selection of households out of those nearly 500 households. Uh, what you see here are about 30 households which fall on the lowest income bracket of this community. This uh, selection of households have highly variable income throughout the year, largely because of the fact that they are agricultural households. They have seasonal variability in incomes strongly linked to the planting and harvesting cycles of the product, of the agricultural product. So on your left, you see the electricity consumption pattern of that household. You see a regular pattern over 36 billing cycles, which is each cycle is 2 months. Um, So that is 72 months of worth of data here that shows that the pattern of electricity consumption for each of these low-income household remains fairly the same over the years. There are peaks of consumption, which is closely linked to the seasonal needs of heating and cooling. And the pattern for each of the household shows a fairly consistent consumption pattern. The figure on the right is the accumulated non-payments or the debt of the household to the electricity company, where they tend to accumulate the debt due to non-payments of bills over a period of time, which reaches a peak coinciding with the planting season, and then it sharply falls to zero or nearly zero in some cases, as and when the income increases. And this cycle repeats over the 36 billing periods here. So what is essentially happening here, that the flexible bill payments mechanism at work behind this phenomena is delinking the ability of the households to pay for electricity use from its ability to consume and pursue sustained value creation from electricity consumption. So this is a positive social value proposition, and we know that this is a generative system because the first two elements of the nexus are very clear, that the availability and access of the service is consistent, and the ability to translate the services to meaningful outcomes is sustained over time for these households, despite their reduction in the financial capabilities or the economic capability of the household. So how does this happen? Or before we get there, why is this important? This might seem intuitive, but it is not really a common thing. If you look at the contrast, so what you see on your screen is data from about 32 mini-grid projects in countries of East Africa, which follow a prepaid metering system, which means that end users pay upfront the cost of electricity before they can consume it. So you can see that a large majority of customers prefer to make small and more frequent payments. Now, the figure on your right, so the clustering of the dots represents households and their frequency and quantum of payment. So you see that they make more frequent and smaller payments, and the net effect, the figure on the right, shows the eventual decline in energy consumption with time among these households or in these projects. The cumulative consumption for each of these mini-grid projects goes down over time, and it's unstable. So there is no repeatable patterns that could be identified here, and thus the conclusion that the ability to pay and the ability to consume and utilize electricity is delayed. So what we see here is a dampening effect of the pressure created by more frequent payments to the overall consumption of electricity. So with this contrast, one can conclude that the delinking of the ability to consume from the ability to pay is an important social value proposition for low income households with variable incomes. Now, if we look at now it's time to put this information in perspective and gather data and understand the nexus and the system that makes this work. So what we do here is utilizing the layered data that we have collected and trace the nexus, create a trace of what dynamics, what elements of the system are at work here in creating this positive generative outcome or generative nexus. So starting with the core of the generative nexus, where we see that households are able to consume adequate levels of electricity during low-income months, enabled by the case-based enforcement and waivers of payments and penalties by the service provider. And that results in an increased sense of ownership among the community, creates a sense of solidarity and commitment to the continued success of the project. So this is the socially generative core of this particular project in question that we have been able to identify using social value of energy maps as a tool to understand the dynamics of value creation. While looking at this, we also look at the benefits and burdens proposition. So what we see is that during certain times in the year, which in this particular case is 2 out of the 4 quarters in a year, there is a revenue deficit for the project, which is made up at the end of the year. It's overcome as people pay their overdue bills. However, for those 2 quarters of the year, the project has a higher vulnerability because of their low reserves to spend on any urgent repairs, for example, or to create better financing mechanisms or invest more in upgrades. So one of the consequences of the generative loop is this increase in vulnerability for the project for a part of the year. Now, how is this balanced by the remaining system, the remaining elements and actors in the system? So the important actors in the system are 3. The local management of the project, which is the Village Electricity Committee, the state level entity, which operates as oversight and technical manager for the project. And then there are the policy entities of the state, which have provided finance and the legal mechanisms for the creation and sustenance of this project. What the generative loop and the consequences result from is a greater autonomy at the local level, and as a result, increased responsiveness in decision making to enable the case-based enforcement, as we have discussed before. So the interaction that is happening here is that the local management has an increase in capacity over time because of they have been trained, they have learned from their experiences. They now know how to monitor the situation for a particular group of customers. And even before that, being able to identify those customer groups and engage in meaningful ways with them so that they are able to execute this case-based decision driven by data. Another capacity that has emerged and developed over time is the ability to manage the oscillations in the revenue and plan expenditures according to that as an adaptation to the increased vulnerability. Now, this has been enabled on the other side by support provided by the state level entities and the policy entities by creating the cushion or the safety nets in terms of technology, skills, and finances for this particular project, and also other projects that replicate this particular model. Now, we have isolated parts of the nexus here in terms of the outcome phenomena, in terms of the actors and the actions they are undertaking. But a critical piece of the nexus that we need to understand here are the feedbacks and how they feed into the decision-making process of the different entities engaged in this the nexus, in producing, in enabling this generative nexus. So if we look at the state level entity, how are they making decisions? When to provide support? What is the good time, a good time to intervene and support the local management, and what is a good time to let them be and function autonomously? So the data points to 3 particular feedback loops that the state level entity utilizes in their decision-making process. First is the quality of the generative nexus based on the records kept by the local management and other forms of feedback by the community. They are able to track the quantum and magnitude of generative outcomes produced in the community by electricity consumption, and particularly for the low income groups. That's one data point that feeds back positively and creates the positive bias towards continuing and sustaining this intervention by the state entity. The second data point that the state entity is able to track is in terms of the capacities and the growth in the capacities of the local management entity or the village electricity committee in their ability to track, monitor, engage with their customers, manage autonomously their revenue, make decisions independently, and how those decisions uh, uh, enable and reinforce the generative nexus for its end users. The third data point or feedback loop that is essential for the state level entity to make decisions is keeping a track of the revenue deficit and vulnerability by extension of the project. So if the revenue deficit for the first 2 quarters, for example, is not overcome in the final 2 quarters, then that is a negative feedback and a signal for the state level entity to step in and intervene in the management practices. Also, the vulnerability to natural phenomena like changes in rainfall pattern or flooding that causes damage to infrastructure and requires technological and financial intervention is another feedback loop that triggers decision at the state level entity. The other set of feedback, which is more pertinent to maintaining and sustaining this generative feedback loop, it's this generative nexus at the community level go on, is the feedback the local management gets from the same set of outcomes and same set of phenomena, but they are processed differently and they are utilized to make decisions at the local level. Now, what we have seen are different combinations and different flows, different pathways of the flow of information and resources in this nexus that results in the generative outcomes. Now, a critical thing to note here is that the generative outcome may not necessarily always be by design. In this particular case, this is a process of learning by the local management and identification of this generative nexus possibility as they went along and as they learned from the experiences of their customers. So what was critical in that learning process was the ability to gather and process data at local levels so that they can act upon without delay. So you can understand the concept of delay here. If you look at the system level distance of each of the 3 entities in question from the community. So the local management is the closest to the community, which means that they are able to gather, analyze, process, and make decisions based on data at a much faster rate than the state level entity would be able to do because the reporting frequency to them is annual. Similarly, the policy entity would take even longer because the annual reporting frequency may become longer because of the decision delays at that level. So at each of the level, as they get closer to the community in terms of administrative distance, the decision-making speed is higher, and therefore the learning has been higher. So one of the key exchanges that is happening here among the four actors, the community members or the households, the local management, the state level entity, and the policy entity, is the exchange in knowledge and capacities as a bidirectional flow that is happening in this nexus, which is changing over time, which is changing with the experiences of each entity and the information and knowledge they transfer to each entities. A critical element or critical dependencies of nexus dynamics in this. So what we have traced here, the nexus, is a static snapshot of what has been happening in terms of the phenomena, in terms of the outcome, and in terms of the exchanges. What a static picture does not capture are the dependencies of time, as we have discussed, that there are delays in transfer of information, there are delays in making decisions and the processing of that information and at each level, and they are sometimes a function of the administrative distance, they are sometimes a functions of the capacities among each actors to process and gather data. So the temporal nature of the nexus is a critical element that should be described when we are describing nexus. The second critical dependency are shifts in the human, social, and cultural characteristics of each of these entities. Now, remember the idea of socio-energy systems, that the human structures or the social structures around the technology in the socio-energy system are made up of people who are undergoing shifts. So there are shifts in the demography. So people with different values, different kind of training and different knowledge systems make up the governance entities that are relevant in this particular case. Similarly, there are demographic shifts. The younger people with a different kind of experience may become decision makers. So those are internal properties of each actor, each kind of actor in this particular system that would determine over a longer period of time how decision making happens and if the shape of this nexus undergoes change or not. So for today, I would stop here and we will discuss other examples in the next session. What I would like to do for the remaining time we have today is to discuss your questions and observations on the idea of nexus and how the data that we have collected at different stages and in a layered fashion fits into this. So open for questions now.
Why don't you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah. Seems like people don't have questions or they're still processing the information.
Hi, Dr. Saurav. Hi, Clark.
Hi, Prasamsa. Go ahead.
This question might not make sense, but it just came to my mind. So, so bear with me. While we are tracking the nexus between the community and the national entity, and whether the intervention, such as electricity, makes a socially generative feedback loop, is there a certain time frame that we have to analyze, or how long does it take to analyze? How long does the data should be?
Yes, that's a very relevant question. So if we were approaching the problem or the data from, let's say, from the perspective of the policy entity or from the perspective of the state level entity that manages this project, uh, we would have to set boundaries or identify the time frame for which the data should be collected or the analysis should focus onto, uh, to a time scale that is relevant to those perspectives, right? For example, we can take policy making cycles as our time frame. If the policy making cycle of that particular place is a 5-year period, then we would want to take that. Another way of identifying the time scale would be to look at the infrastructure. So we know that infrastructure is built for a certain lifetime. It has periods after which there are upgrades or dismantling or refurbishing is required. So that could be one way of identifying the time scale or the time snapshot required for the data to reveal meaningful outcomes. However, remember that the energy poverty nexus and the social value framework is a user-centered, a people-centered inquiry. So the the investigation is largely informed by that perspective. So we began by understanding the social value proposition of a particular kind of service, resource, or infrastructure in that particular community. So the question of what is a relevant time span of collecting data is informed by the dynamics and the evolution of the social value creation process in the community. So if the social value creation has happened over a period of 10 years or 15 years, then we look at changes at other levels of the system for that time period. Now, there would obviously be constraints in gathering that kind of data. It may not be available. So in this particular case, for example, the policy level data from 20 years ago, this study was done in 2018, and the policy mechanism that enabled this project came into force in the early 90s. So there was obviously very little anecdotal evidence available at the policy making level. What happened and who were the actors responsible for making that policy decision 25 years ago. So those were the limitations. However, the time frame was set largely by the evolution of the social value creation process that happened in the community, starting from the creation of the intervention, the changes it went through, and the gradual, the succession of the different value propositions as they emerged over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Let me add a slightly different perspective, though. You know, obviously, when we think about data, and especially when we think about statistical data, we think about the viability, statistical viability of our conclusions, right? And so we think about t-tests, and we think about adequate sampling, adequate samples in terms of numbers of samples, and adequate samples in terms of temporality to capture patterns that are happening, and all of those kinds of things. And all of that is very important. But at the same time, you know, data, especially when we come at it from a kind of a user-centered perspective, which can mean the energy user or the technology user, but can really mean any human being who's situated in these contexts. So it could be in Saurabh's case, the people who are using energy and paying their bills in these microgrids that he was discussing. It could be the people who are managing those microgrids, or it could be the people who are regulating those microgrids and providing backstop support at the level of the state. And for any of those users, you're hopefully constantly using data to track performance and identify things that you need to learn, as Saurabh was saying, right? It's a constantly learning, hopefully it's a constantly learning environment, right? Where even if the system is performing perfectly and people are paying their bills and using energy and managing the system and repairing it as needed and getting support from the state where needed, and all of that is working well, hopefully it's sufficiently generative that in fact people are growing businesses and they're evolving new needs. And so at some point there might be a need to expand the system. How do you tell? Well, you've got to be collecting data that's giving you indicators, right? And so a single anomalous data point may not be statistically significant, but it might nonetheless start to tell you things that you should be paying attention. And you don't want to draw conclusions from it, but that doesn't mean that you don't start inquiring into what's going on here, right? So in these microgrids with prepaid accounts that Saurabh was talking about, the first indicator should be that people at various times of the year in these communities are not using as much electricity. And you might just I mean, you could sort of say, well, I can explain that. You know, it's the low season, and so there's no, you know, whatever load, right? And so you just blow it off. Well, or you could ask yourself, why is it that these people are using less energy during this time of the year? And you start to inquire, and you don't know why, but maybe you collect some more data on that. Is it true? Is it actually statistically the case that during August and September, they start using less energy? Or, you know, or is there, you know, or you could start to inquire with folks and maybe ask around, right? What's going on? Why are you all using less energy this month, right? So you use it as an indicator. It may not be initially statistically significant. You may find yourself having to collect more data in order to create that significance. You might need to collect data on new things, right? Because all you're getting with your prepaid meters is you're getting how much they're actually paying each month, right? You're not getting their ability to pay or their willingness to pay data on a monthly basis. So maybe you do a pilot project, you collect some new data, right? And you use that to learn, right? So I think there's always trade-offs between the accuracy and significance of data sets versus, you know, their ability to serve as potential indicators of what might be happening. And so you're hopefully in a situation where you're using your data in a variety of different modalities, some of which is to try to detect problems, some of which is to try to detect trends, some of which is to try to draw tentative conclusions, some of which is to try to draw real conclusions, right, about about causal linkages. And all of those are, and then you're also taking an adaptive approach in which the quantity of data that you need, the quality of data that you need, and the is dependent in some sense on the decision that you're taking. If it's an unbelievably high consequence decision, high stakes decision, which you don't get to repeat because it's a once or and done kind of choice, and it's not in any urgent hurry, then there's all of the justification in the world to develop really robust data resources to support that decision. If it's a low consequence decision that's reversible next month, if it turns out you made a goof, you know, and so forth, then you can rely on more indicative data as opposed to conclusive kinds of data, right?
Yeah. And so on that, sorry, who was speaking?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I'll talk after you finish.
Okay, thank you. So just a thought. So if I were to look at energy poverty nexus of a certain energy intervention, so our community will have paid a certain amount to get that intervention in their community, and then to work with that intervention. So if I were to look at the energy poverty nexus, which by the way I will do my research on, is so will I be comparing the income benefit that the community or the end users have gotten out of that intervention, and then compare it to the initial investment that they've made, or what are the types of uh, indicators that I have to look into to analyze the energy poverty nexus?
So what you describe is a common dilemma of looking into Nexus. And this comes from largely from the fact that we have been conditioned to understand this relationship as a static thing. Like if you look at energy poverty as an indicator, we have been conditioned to think largely in terms of one static indicator.
Mm-hmm.
Energy poverty nexus is not a static indicator. The idea behind this, that these are loops, these are systems of feedback that are dynamic and that have had certain qualities in the past and currently have certain qualities, but they will not resemble what they have been in the future. So it is based on the idea that these generative or extractive feedback loops co-evolve. That means they change, there are shifts in them as the surrounding conditions change. So the nexus is really not about indicators. It's about how it's shifting, how is it transitioning. It's about that process of transition that is happening and the constant changes in the value proposition. So, what a value proposition of an intervention at the time of its inception will not remain the same or follow a linear growth trajectory at the 10th year of the intervention. So, and that is the idea and why this is a constantly learning system and requires a higher intensity of data, particularly in the social value proposition, is that the idea of nexus is more anticipatory rather than historical. It is about the creation and the shifts that are happening, because you know, a value proposition that was valuable 10 years ago may not be even relevant today. So there really is no comparison. For this, you take the case that we were discussing. At the time of inception in the early 90s, for a remote village in the foothills of the Himalayas, a single light bulb was an extraordinarily high value proposition.
Yeah.
A single light bulb today is in fact a negative value proposition. It's a value diminishing proposition because the surrounding the conditions have changed. The community understands, and the aspirations of households are way different than it was 25 years ago. And a single light bulb will not only be sufficient, but will act to hold that aspiration down. It would be counterproductive to provide a household with one light bulb today, as it would have been 25 years ago. So the value proposition is not same. So hence benchmarking might be possible in certain cases, but in most cases, a historical benchmarking is not really a relevant idea when looking at Nexus and its generativity or extractivity.
So can I, so I wanted to interject on several comments.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
First, on your comment about the progress, like over 10 years and the dynamics. So basically the outcome, how we're phrasing it is, and it's basically taking what you all said very early on, is that the community is able to perpetually improve their livelihoods and the well-being and those of others, right? Or help others to do that. So to me, that's really the outcome over the 10 years. And for that to be achieved, you have to have a dynamic system. So the Nexus, the way you're phrasing this is a way of, I don't like the word measure, but you understand what I mean, right? You can track it, you can look at it and see, are we seeing these signs? Or, you know, if something happens with that technology or new technology comes along that's made available, is the community able to adjust and make use of that, right? So, and that's in part where our projects are 10 years, because we know that really we're trying to reach that upper goal. Now, when Prashansa, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly.
That's right.
When she was talking about indicators, those are things that are lower level, meaning they're very linear often. And so you still need to do something with that because your funders and others are looking for that.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you have going on is you actually have, you are, as the person who's running the project or looking at the data, you are looking at the bigger project, focusing on the outcomes, because that's really what gets the value. That's where the value really is, right? But you have a responsibility to still deal with the lower level type things that people are used to seeing and understand. And hopefully in time, they will come along. So, so when we look at this, the indicators, again, are, you know, we, for the purposes of development and for the bigger picture, we use those as weak signals, okay? And weak signals are patterns or things that may indicate that there may be patterns, right? That you look for so that you can proactively engage them. Okay, so when Clark was describing and Saurabh, they were talking about indicators, you can still use them in that light in terms of even the idea of the social value nexus, because they are giving you signs that something's going on in the system.
Yeah.
But you might have to use those or different indicators when you're trying to report, like KPIs and metrics, you know, for project development, for implementation, for consumption. All those things are still important because the funders are going to look for that. Okay. So you have to learn how to work at different levels is basically what I'm trying to say, right? So, so I just wanted to indicate that. And the last thing I wanted to just make a comment was, and it's finally a clear revelation. So when we're talking about doing what we're doing, basically you're trying to, if you're doing this up front, this effort of the social value and understanding of that and the nexus, you're really creating a business case that has alternative solutions that you decide, you know, one is the best because you're involving the community. So in that sense, you can take this information, it takes it out of the realm of how we want to discuss it because we're looking at the longer term. But when you need to communicate to partners who don't understand this, they understand the black and white, they understand the linear process. All of this stuff that we're putting together in essence is coming into a business case. And being able to describe it in a way that they will understand it in their current understanding is important to translate what we're, you know, what you're trying to indicate here. Because some really, in our case, I don't know about with Saurabh and Clark, they may not actually care about the things we care about. Okay, so, you know, so they just want to know 1, 2, 3, and that's it. So our responsibility is to ensure that we don't operate that way, but that we can still communicate to the people who do, because they often will have the resources.
Thank you.
Hello all, this is Jomo here. I've been reading quite a number of papers on energy poverty over the past weeks. And what I've learned is that in some jurisdictions and contexts, consumers who are poor, they deliberately curtail their energy use and they give up on some uses that they do not consider as critical or necessary, right? So in the circumstances, oftentimes they are able to be on time with their payments to the utility. They are actually experiencing energy poverty. It's hidden energy poverty, actually. So even though they're not expending more than 10% of their income on electricity and energy, generally they're actually in energy poverty. And I was actually wondering if this may be a consideration in the case you highlighted with those consumers who use the prepaid system. In the second set of graphs you illustrated today, Sarah, I don't know if you got my question or my point. I would like to.
No, I got your question, and it's a very important question, and that is something that we have largely misunderstood because of thinking about indicative numbers as conclusive numbers. So, and this is a classical problem that has been emerging over time, and there's been more evidence recently that this has been the case, is that putting those caps, those thresholds to identify whether a household is energy poor or not, does not fully reflect the ability of the service to deliver its potential. And that is precisely at the heart of the idea of social value, is where we are less concerned about the quantum of consumption and more concerned about what it results into, the utilization, what kind of utility it creates, what kind of ability it creates among end users to pursue outcomes, which are so. Consumption of electricity by itself does not increase anyone's well-being or quality of life. It increases well-being by enabling certain functions, whether to generate more income, whether to live more comfortably, it's safe, making surroundings safer, and so on. So, and that is precisely the reason that in the concepts of social value and in tracking the nexus, we are looking at outcomes from the utilization of the service instead of measuring the quantum of consumption of the service. So you're right, and that was one of the motivations of trying to develop a methodology that moves away from that trap.
Yes, thanks, Doc. Right, so it's not only about providing access, it's actually important to determine what the electricity or energy generally is used for. And hopefully,
or any service for that matter.
Yes, and hopefully the benefits would outweigh the risk and the costs in the majority of cases or circumstances. I think that's what we ought to aim for.
Right. All right, we are past time. So thank you for your questions and interactive session today. We will continue this discussion. We'll look at a few other examples and discuss more about the variety of forms and structures a Nexus can take.